In the heart of a world on the verge of collapse, an order resonates with strangely specific details. Build a colossal vessel, with exact measurements, selected materials, and compartmentalized architecture. The story is in Genesis, but what few people realize is that, between the verses about judgment and salvation, there is embedded a technical project that spans the centuries and still intrigues scholars of the exact sciences today. Noah's Ark, often reduced to the childish image of a boat with animals in pairs, emerges under close observation as one of the most impressive structures of antiquity, not only for its spiritual symbology, but for the level of engineering involved. But how can we explain such technical precision in a period before the great scientific civilizations? How in the 3rd millennium before Christ would anyone have enough knowledge to design a vessel as efficient as those that would only be replicated almost 4,000 years later? If you like exploring the Bible from a historical, scientific, and non-obvious perspective, subscribe to the channel. Here, each ancient text is treated as an enigma to be deciphered, with facts, archaeology, and critical analysis, always looking for what's behind the narrative. The dimensions of the Ark are not generic: 300 cubits long, 50 wide, and 30 high. Converting to modern metric, we are about 135 meters long, 22 meters wide, and 13 meters high. This makes her comparable in size and proportion to contemporary cargo ships. And interestingly, her elongated, rectangular shape is much closer to a stability barge than a ship with a prow. In other words, it was not designed to sail, but to float with balance in turbulent waters, which makes perfect sense within the biblical proposal to resist a global flood. One of the most relevant studies is that of the Korean Naval and Ocean Engineering Research Institute, which tested scale models of the Ark in extreme simulations. The result was unequivocal. The specified proportion represents an optimized balance between stability, load capacity, and impact resistance. This ratio, 1:6 length to width, did not arise again until the 19th century, and even then it required generations of trial and error. The Ark does not behave like an allegory. It responds to real physical, structural, and hydrodynamic laws. And this puts the biblical narrative under a new focus, not as a fable, but as a record of a forgotten technology, and extremely advanced for its time. The analysis of the proportions would be enough to place the Ark among the most intriguing projects of antiquity. However, the biblical text goes beyond measurements. He mentions a specific material: gopher, wood. Although the original Hebrew term has no direct correspondence in modern languages, many scholars associate this wood with highly resinous, dense, and resistant species, such as cypress or red cedar, both known for their durability and use in constructions that require resistance to moisture and weather. Civilizations from the ancient Near East, especially in Mesopotamia and the Levant region, already used similar wood in temples, vessels, and even sealed sarcophagi, which reinforces the idea that there was, indeed, technical knowledge involved in the selection of the material. But the choice of wood is not the only technical element present. The text also mentions the use of bitumen, a sticky, waterproofing substance of mineral origin, used to seal the structure both inside and out. This type of sealing was common in Sumerian and Akkadian cultures, where bitumen was applied to bricks to build ziggurats and irrigation canals. Its use in the Ark reveals familiarity with rudimentary chemical practices and a functional mastery over natural materials, which further reinforces the idea that this knowledge did not arise spontaneously in the hands of Noah, but was part of a previous technological tradition, which perhaps was lost with the collapse of antediluvian societies. Another technical detail mentioned in the text is the compartmentalized structure of the Ark. The internal division, recorded in Genesis chapter 6, verse 14, does not appear there as a narrative curiosity. It is an architectural solution with clear functions, allowing the isolation of animals by type, better distributing the weight of live cargo and preventing structural collapse of the vessel under pressure and movement. Modern naval engineers recognize that compartmentalizing large floating structures is essential for stability and control, especially on wooden vessels. This is not just a functional project, but a convergence of advanced techniques. Selection of material with specific properties, application of natural waterproofing, and strategic structural division. These elements, described in an ancient text, do not make up a naive fantasy. They point to a pattern, and patterns like that don't emerge in a vacuum. They require observation, repetition, experimentation. In other words, science. The presence of these techniques cannot be dissociated from the cultural context in which they were recorded. The pre-flood world, described in terms of moral decay, also appears to have harbored a surprising level of technological sophistication. There are scholars who defend the idea that pre-flood humanity was not primitive, but the bearer of knowledge that was fragmented or forgotten after major natural catastrophes. This type of hypothesis is reinforced by archaeological findings that indicate the existence of ancient civilizations with mastery over metallurgy, astronomy, and hydraulics, much earlier than was believed possible. If we look at Mesopotamian accounts, contemporary or prior to the writing of the biblical texts such as the Epic of Gilgamesh, we find striking parallels. One is the construction of an ark to survive a catastrophic flood, also sealed with bitumen and built to deliberate proportions. However, while the Mesopotamian accounts take on more symbolic forms, the Hebrew text stands out for its degree of functional specificity. The biblical ark is not a floating circle or liquid metaphor for chaos. It is an object with constructive logic, consistent with what modern engineers would validate as plausible. This coherence reinforces an often ignored possibility that Noah, even though he was a character inserted in a religious narrative, had access to real technical knowledge, whether through oral transmission, through ancient records, or even through revelation, as the sacred text believes. In either case, the result is an artifact that unites faith and reason in a very rare point of convergence. It is no exaggeration to say that if the Ark were discovered intact today, its structural elements would arouse the interest not only of archaeologists, but also of engineers, architects, and materials scientists. There's also an often overlooked detail: the logistics involved in keeping thousands of species alive for weeks at a time. This includes ventilation, drainage, storage, and access. There is no explicit mention of these mechanisms in the text, but the compartmentalized structure and proportions suggest that such needs were taken into account. A project of this magnitude would require predictability, which again points to a level of planning that goes beyond simple survival by instinct or improvisation. The narrative, when read with attention to its technical content, begins to suggest something else: that the knowledge applied in the construction of the Ark was not an isolated divine privilege, but part of a systematized knowledge that existed, flourished, and perhaps disappeared with the waters that swept that world. This hypothesis, that the Ark represents only the most visible vestige of pre-flood technological knowledge, raises an even deeper question. What else was lost with the destruction of that world? When you look at the narrative from this perspective, it stops being just a moral warning or a story of faith and takes on the contours of a civilizational rupture. The Ark, in this scenario, would not only be a means of biological preservation, but also a link between two eras of humanity: one that knew, built and calculated, and another that would need to relearn everything from scratch. Biblical tradition mentions that Noah lived for centuries after the flood. If this is read within the literary context of the time, it could mean more than literal longevity. It could symbolize the prolonged transmission of knowledge that resisted oblivion. Their descendants became the founders of later nations, which raises the possibility that fragments of this knowledge were passed on and, over time, distorted, mythologized, or absorbed by emerging cultures. There are curious parallels, for example, between the techniques described in the construction of the Ark and certain principles used in Egyptian and Phoenician vessels centuries later, such as the use of internal chambers and sealing with natural resins. Today, when rediscovering ancient sustainable practices in construction, bioengineering, and the use of natural resources, many modern scientists come across ancestral solutions that, in some way, anticipated current science. There is a growing tendency to look at the past with less technological arrogance and more willingness to learn from it. In this sense, Noah's Ark can be seen as a symbol of not only spiritual, but also intellectual resilience, a project that survived destruction, not only to save lives but to preserve ideas. The question that remains is, why would such an old document carry this level of technical complexity? Was it a coincidence, a hyper-elaborated literary construction, or the coded inheritance of a forgotten civilization? The answer may never be definitive, but the constant presence of functional elements, aligned with modern engineering principles, suggests that the biblical text contains more than metaphors. It may be the tip of a historical iceberg, a real vestige of a more sophisticated past than we are prepared to admit. Noah's Ark, when analyzed with this perspective, stops being just a lifeboat and takes the place of a civilizational artifact, a wooden document sealed with bitumen and memory, crossing not only oceans but millennia of human oblivion. If you've made it this far, it's because you value serious, well-researched content that challenges common narratives. Take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and strengthen this project. And if you want to continue on this journey of discovery, stay tuned. The next video will expand these connections even further.